I wanted to, rather than just jumping straight into the suttas, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of, really I want to focus on the conditions that came together for the Buddha to teach his Dharma. And I'm curious, for those in the room, how many of y'all are like super pumped about history and religious study and things like this? Show of hands. It's okay if not, but just curious, okay? And how many of y'all are like, man, the reason I was interested in Buddhism because it's not very religious and I don't really care about the history or and it's okay if that's you, just curious. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, I find that there is this kind of weird juxtaposition of people that find themselves interested in Buddhism is because obviously most of us didn't grow up Buddhist, right? And so obviously our allergy to religion is one of the things that allows us to end up here. And that's not for all of us, but a simple poll would suggest that a lot of us are drawn to Buddhism as 21st century Americans because we didn't have great experiences with religion, right? And so I'm kind of right in the middle. When I first came into the practice, I am someone that was interested in the story of the Buddha, interested in the history and the lineage, but I didn't really study it or grow in curiosity around it for a couple years into my practice. And my teacher at the time, Dave Smith, I asked him, what book should I read on Buddhism? And back then there weren't a ton, actually. Now there are a million. And he gave me this book called Buddhism, A Concise History. It's a very creative title. By two historians that I believe are both also practitioners, named Houston Smith and Philip Novak. And he also, a couple years into my practice, turned me on to a series of talks that was given by a teacher named John Peacock. It's on Audio Dharma, you can still find it, and it's called Buddhism Before Theravada. And they really helped me not only learn some interesting facts about Buddhism, things that I didn't know, but this is kind of my point, it really deepened my understanding of the teachings themselves. Understanding why the Buddha taught what he taught, given what was going on at the time, really deepened my understanding of the teachings and the practices. So I hope for y'all, and the ones that aren't so pumped on studying world religion, that you'll find the same, hopefully. So the focus for today, like I said, is not so much on the origin of Buddhism as a religion. Right? There are different schools of Buddhism, and Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and what do they believe, and how did they come about? It's not so much on that. I want to focus more on what was going on in ancient India during the time that Siddhartha Gautama may have lived, and how that has a dramatic impact on the meaning behind the teachings that he offered. And so we're going to focus kind of on four things, that being the main focus, is what was going on in ancient India. But we're also going to talk about what is the lineage of Wildheart Meditation Center, what style of Buddhism do we practice, and then spoiler alert, it's Theravada Buddhism. And what is Theravada Buddhism? What does it mean? Yeah, no idea. That's why we're going to talk about it. And like I said, what was going on in India at the time that the Buddha lived, that's going to be the main focus. And then lastly, what are the suttas? Because we're going to be doing a sutta study. What are they? And how are they relevant to us as Buddhist practitioners, or maybe even not Buddhist, but Buddha-ish practitioners in 21st century America? Sound good? All right, hopefully it'll be fun. That's my plan. So the first thing I want to talk about is the lineage of Wildheart, but I want to kind of phrase it as, am I Buddhist? Are you Buddhist? It's a trick question, but there's no wrong answer, actually. So I'm going to ask y'all, how many of y'all would say, I'm Buddhist? Cool. How many of y'all would say, I'm not Buddhist? All right. How many of y'all like in between? Show me your in between. Okay. A lot of in between. Nice. So one of the rare and precious things about the Buddhist tradition is that there's not really a consensus on what it means to be Buddhist, right? And so this is, I think, the reason why most of us are in this category. There's not really a consensus on what that means or what that looks like. You're kind of, if you just look at the teachings, it's pretty obvious that the Buddha's kind of saying, you're a member when you say you are, right? And if you don't want to be a part of the club, well, we'll have you anyway. We got to understand, if you just look at history, in order for a spiritual tradition to survive for a period of time, it has to become really intertwined in the culture and the society. It kind of has to become a religion in a way, or take on some type of structured aspects. And so if we all grew up in Myanmar, you would have gone to the temple, you would have made offerings to the monks, you would have probably gotten married by a monk. When you were a kid, you would have probably gone to the monastery during the summer. Much like the institution of the Christian church functions in a lot of the US, it functions in Buddhist countries. And so how could you not call yourself a Buddhist if you grew up in Myanmar? But for most of us, we didn't grow up in a Buddhist community. We are what the scholars like to call American convert Buddhists. That's not all of us. Some of y'all may have grown up in Buddhist culture or society. But for most of us, we didn't. And so I think we can often feel like we have a hard time claiming or naming ourselves as Buddhists, because it doesn't feel like it's ours. Maybe more so than any other dominant world religion, Buddhism, or the Buddhist teachings rather, are radically non-dogmatic. In some ways, it's kind of not very Buddhist to be Buddhist. And the Buddha really actually harped on this a lot. Like a lot. He kind of talked about how important it was to not identify, create this kind of like fundamentalism around this idea of I am this or I am that. He actually, central to his teaching was that's what causes so much of our suffering, is holding to fixed views. It's one of the first fetters to our awakening in the traditional path, is clinging to fixed views. And just to share a sutta, today I wanted to offer a sutta called the Kalama Suit, where the Buddha teaches about the importance of not holding to fixed views. And the brief background to this story is there's a village of people called the Kalamas. And the Kalamas were like Atlanta, Georgia, right? It's like all the bands toured there at the time. You know, they may not end up in Birmingham, Alabama, but you know that they're going to come to Atlanta, Georgia. And so all the spiritual traditions of the day went through the town of the Kalamas. And they got kind of sick of it because they were like, well, who should we believe? Like 1 week it's the Jains, and the next week it's the ascetics, and the next week it's this other guru, and then the Buddha comes in and says, I'm fully enlightened. Who should we believe? And they come to the Buddha and they say, who should we believe? Why should we believe you? And this was the Buddha's response. He says, don't go by oral traditions or by the lineage of teaching. Don't go by hearsay or a collection of scriptures, or by logical reasoning, or by inferential reasoning, or by a reflection on your reasons, or by the acceptance of a view after pondering it. Don't go by the seeming competence of the speaker, or because you think, this guru is our teacher. He said, but only when you know for yourself these things, when taken and practiced, are skillful. They lead to my happiness and my welfare. Then you should practice them. And we've got to remember that the Buddha's dying words were, be an island unto yourself, take no external refuge. His disciples that had followed him his whole life were freaking out when he was dying, and they're like, what are we going to do? What if this all just falls apart? Our teacher's gone. Our teacher's dying. And he kind of said, have y'all not been listening? Like if you read the sutta, it almost has this kind of vibe of the Buddha being like, y'all have not been listening. It's almost like he's freaked out. Oh shit, they have a lot of attachment to the teacher. And that's when he says, be an island unto yourself, with yourself as a refuge, taking no other refuge. So the Buddha really wanted to wear our Buddhist clothes very loosely. And while I think especially it's appealing for us as Westerners to have a world religion tell us that we don't have to claim this authority, you don't have to be a Buddhist, you don't have to identify or join the club, I think that there's also a lot of benefit to identifying as a Buddhist, to seeing yourself as a part of a community, to seeing yourself as someone that has a path, that has a little bit of support around how to be skillful in your life, how to show up with compassion and wisdom. It gives us a roadmap, it gives us a community. It also is all premised on the idea that all of us can wake up in this lifetime. There's a very liberating aspiration to our practice. You know, it really changed how I practiced when I started to feel, and this was a process for me, when I started to actually feel internally like liberation was possible. Now, I couldn't tell you what liberation means. I couldn't tell you in words or philosophy what nirvana is or any of that stuff, and I don't really care, but when I started to feel in my heart that I can wake up, that I can find a deep and profound peace and happiness in this lifetime, when I started to feel connected to that myself, it radically changed the way that I viewed my life, my whole life. And so I think there's a lot of benefit with joining the club. And we're not historically people that like to be a part of the in crowd, you know? I mean, that's been my experience of meeting people around Wildheart. And in some ways, we're a part of because we've always felt like we've been apart from. And that's a cool thing to connect around. You know, it's pretty weird and wild to be a part of a Buddhist community in the Bible Belt. And we found each other. So I guess what I would say is just a little encouragement, welcome. And if you feel apprehensive about this label of Buddhist, just know that you're welcome to it, or you can leave it. But it's here for the taking. It's freely offered. So what is Wildhearts Lineage? How did we, as Wildheart Meditation Center, get here? Like I said, we're American convert Buddhists. Most of us did not grow up culturally Buddhist. Cultural Buddhist communities have existed in the U.S. for a long time. Even though mostly white people, mostly hippies in the 70s, didn't really find it until the 60s and the 70s, cultural Buddhist communities have been here for a long time. And thanks to people like Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg and Jack Kornfield that went over to Thailand and Burma during the 60s and 70s, they brought back these teachings and these practices, and we kind of sprang out of that movement. So Wildheart is rooted in what's called Theravada Buddhism. And Theravada Buddhism is sometimes, and now I'm going to talk about Theravada and its features, is sometimes it's referred to as the way of the elders. It's old school Buddhism. The Theravadan lineage is actually mostly monastic. If you tell a Buddhist monk in Thailand that you're a Theravadan Buddhist, they'll be like, no, you're not. Because you're not wearing the robes. You're not in a monastery. And again, this wouldn't be a judgment, but because mostly Theravadan Buddhism has been preserved since the time that the Buddha lived, and it's been preserved in the monastic order. So it's that old school. It goes back to the earliest formulation of the monks, the Sangha. It's mostly monastic. Theravadan Buddhists, this is the most important piece of what makes a Theravadan Buddhist a Theravadan Buddhist, is that they connect their practice to the Polycanon, to the earliest teachings of the Buddha. And they believe that liberation is possible, as the Buddha laid out in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and the practice of the four foundations of mindfulness being the direct path to liberation. Theravadan Buddhists refer to the text. Sometimes they call us list worshippers, because the Buddha organized his teaching in a very systematic way, where there are lots of lists: 4 truths, Eightfold Path, 5 spiritual faculties, 7 awakening factors, 12 links of dependent origination, 5 aggregates. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So I feel like the Theravadan Buddhists are very pragmatic. They're very non-dogmatic. It's very much about the Sangha, or the community. They engage in devotion. It's called puja. And puja is chanting, and it's reverence or faith in the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But this isn't a theistic devotional practice. It's like, how could you have devotion to something that you're already a part of, right? From a Buddhist perspective, engaging in devotion is about celebrating the connection with your potential to wake up, and with the path, and with the community that's around you. So it's not external, I guess, is what I'm saying, the devotional practice. It's communal. All right, so this is Theravadan Buddhist, and the most important thing is that we hearken back to the earliest teachings, most notably something called the Polycanon. All right, now this is the part that I really wanted to focus on, which is what was going on in the Buddha's life around the time that he would have started teaching, that shaped his message, and maybe will shape our understanding of the Dharma. Does anyone know when the Buddha lived, when he was born? Just curious. Yeah.
600 years BC.
Yeah, that's the scholars used to say 600. You know how they debate these things and pick these things apart over time. Now they say that it's probably more close to the Buddha being born in 480 BCE, and that he probably died around 400 BCE, because time works backwards when you go to the BC era. So it's a long time ago, 2,600 years ago, the Buddha lived. I just want to very briefly give a shout out to 3 important figures that kind of came after the Buddha, right after, that without them we wouldn't really be here. The first is King Ashoka. And King Ashoka lived a couple hundred years after the Buddha's death. Some people think that he might have lived actually even closer, like 100 years after the Buddha died. And King Ashoka was the great unifier of the Indian subcontinent. He was like the one that basically put all of these regions together under one law and one kingdom. And he adopted Buddhism. And the scholars think, well, if you look at having to kind of keep this many people in control, right, in your kingdom, you kind of have to adopt some type of centralized governing structure to keep the order. And he thought, well, Buddhism's pretty good. Be kind, don't be violent, you know, peaceful, calm, vibey people. Buddhism. So he was a big fan of Buddhism, and because of that, he erected stupas, he sent Buddhist missionaries to parts of Southeast Asia, as religions do. Get involved in politics and spread. King Ashoka was kind of the person that did it for us. Good, bad, or otherwise, right? And then a few hundred years, in about 5th century CE, so around 400, Buddhaghosa is a Buddhist monk, translator, commentator, created something called the Basuti Maga. And the Basuti Maga was to try to kind of revitalize the Buddhist teaching and to focus it more on practice. So Buddhism became a religion, and the monks met and they discussed Buddhist matters, and they mostly kind of stayed away from the community and went in their own little world. Buddhaghosa wanted to kind of bring meditation back and bring the Buddhist teaching back into practice. And so he created something called the Basuti Maga, which means the path of purification. And we still use this today, and Theravadan Buddhists often use the Basuti Maga as one of their main texts. So thanks to King Ashoka, Buddhaghosa, and then last but not least, Mahasi Sayadaw lived in the early 1900s. And Buddhism went through another kind of dark period and was being pressed on by British colonialism. And in Burma at the time was about to be dealing with the possible extinction of Buddhism as they knew it. And Mahasi Sayadaw said, we've got to teach this stuff to lay people. We've got to stop being just monks in our own world again. So you see how they had to learn their lesson over and over again to stop being so isolated from the regular people, the commoners. And so he developed a method of insight meditation, and he started teaching lay practitioners to practice meditation again. And without him, we wouldn't have mindfulness-based everything that we have in the US. John Kabat-Zinn wouldn't have brought it over. Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein wouldn't have brought it over. So backing up, 400 BCE, 480, 400 BCE was a time of a lot of political struggle. It was a time of a lot of economic struggle. Basically, there were all these regions in modern-day Nepal and India that were rural and decentralized. A lot of them were based on agriculture. And there started to be a surplus. They started producing more than they needed to use. And what happens in economies when you start producing more than you need to use, you start to centralize your power. You start to focus all of your economy in cities. And this was happening at the time that the Buddha was alive. So when there's a lot of political and economic and religious change, there's a pro and a con. There's a lot of oppression, but there's also a lot of progressivism. There are a lot of people that are challenging ideas, and this was happening when the Buddha was alive. Siddhartha Gautama would have been born in the Kosala region of modern-day Nepal, used to be northeastern India. And he would have been really close to a city called Kapilavatthu, which was like all the thinkers, all the economy, all of the stuff was happening there. So the scholars think that the Buddha actually would have probably been pretty well educated and been introduced to a lot of different ideas and philosophies of his time. And this is why you even see how a lot of the Greeks that were alive at the same exact time that the Buddha was alive have some of the very same philosophies and ideas as Buddhism. Things like Stoicism, I don't know the period of the Stoics, but a lot of the ancient Greeks share a lot of the same ideas. So they think that maybe the Buddha crossed paths with some of these ideas. It was not only a time of a lot of change, it was a time of a lot of class struggle. There were 4 major classes during the time that the Buddha lived. Siddhartha was born into the Kshatriya class, which is the warrior class. He was not a prince. He would have just been a privileged kid, growing up in a place where his family had relative power and he could have been well educated. And there were a lot of people during the time questioning the oppressive structures of society, a lot of people dropping out. There was a countercultural movement. So you'll see when you read the suttas, and the reason why I'm sharing all of this is you'll actually see if you read the suttas that the Buddha's referring to and talking about a lot of other spiritual wanderers. Like Jainism came out of the same exact time the Buddha lived. The Buddha studied with 2 gurus that taught him concentration meditation, which is not the Buddha's idea. It was something that was already around. So Buddhism didn't arrive in a vacuum. There were a lot of these ideas were already a part of the culture. Religion was also really entrenched in the class system. And we can look back on this and be like, oh man, that's fucked up. They were so oppressive and religious and fundamentalist. But at the time, this kind of pre-Hindu, post-Vedic India, it's not Hinduism, it's called Brahmanism, had been around for hundreds of years, and it was just entrenched in the worldview. And I want to share some of the beliefs of this religion that was around. Well, first, you couldn't really access it fully unless you were a part of the Brahmin class. And if you were a part of the Brahmin class, your whole role was to perform these rituals. And it helped keep the order. So you perform these rituals, you were born into this class, it was your duty. And if you did that, you would uphold kind of the cosmic order. So you see that the class and you doing your job to stay in your class was the most important thing you could do spiritually for the world. That was kind of the idea. It gave you what they called an ashrama. You heard the word ashram? Ashrama means place in society. And it was originally kind of about your class. So if you're a warrior, you do what the warriors do. If you're a merchant, you do what the merchants do. If you're a menial laborer, you do what the menial laborers do. You're supposed to do that, and it upholds the order. If you want to know what it's called when the order is upheld, it's called swastika, which is where Adolf Hitler got this idea from. Swastika actually means the good life, and it's why you see the swastika in some Tibetan Buddhist iconographies, because it wasn't originally Adolf Hitler's idea. Right? On one hand, you could look at it and say, well, the idea was that we all work together to live in harmony with each other, and we have a good life. That's a good principle. But in reality, how it happened during the time of the Buddha is that unless you did exactly what you were supposed to do that you were born into, you couldn't buck the system. Unless you did that, then society was going to deteriorate, and you were cast out. So to recap, during the Buddha's life, it was a time of a lot of change, a lot of struggle for power. There was a lot of class stratification, and it was dominated by this kind of deterministic religious worldview. So how would have society have shaped the way that the Buddha taught? This actually changes our understanding of some of the teachings, I found. Let's look at the teaching of karma. Well, we kind of know what karma is not going to be from a Buddhist perspective. It's not going to be this linear and deterministic idea that if you did bad in your past life, you were born into a bad place in this life, and that's your duty. No, because that's what the Buddha grew up in, and that's what he was opposed to. So the Buddha shifted the emphasis of karma from this kind of like spiritual bank that you're always working against into this power of your actions being the seed of your liberation. It's not what you're born into that makes a difference. It's how you react and act that makes a difference in the world. So the Buddha switched karma from meaning this kind of moral determinism into this internal cultivation of your mind, reactivity, trying to practice being more skillful in your behaviors, and him saying that your freedom comes from your ability to practice skillful thoughts and behaviors, and ultimately to realize the nature of this experience, consciousness, insight. So this is pretty major. The Buddha's saying that it's a very empowering teaching, I feel like, is that your happiness is not based on what you get, but how you relate to what you get. The Buddha also demoted the role of gods in rituals, and this is what I talked about earlier. He was pretty fanatical about being anti-dogmatism and theism. You know, he acknowledged that gods exist because it was the science of his time. It was like saying that, you know, electricity isn't real. He acknowledged gods, and you'll hear him talk about gods and different realms of existence and things like that, but he basically says they have nothing to do with your salvation. They have nothing to do with breaking out of this cycle of samsara. So he demoted gods, he demoted rituals. He broke out of the class system, which was pretty dramatic for the time. Even though he drug his feet a little bit on inviting women into the monastic order, he still, after some convincing, did it during his lifetime. We got to understand, 2,600 years ago, that's pretty radical. It's kind of cool, I think. He also questioned this idea of an internal soul, this idea of eternal salvation and soul. He said that there's actually nothing that exists that's not changing. That who you call yourself is a verb and not a noun. There's no eternal soul. There's an ever-changing self that's constructed out of cause and effect. You're always dependently arising in conditions, and new conditions meeting other conditions, and moving conditions forward. So these were some of the features of the Buddha's teaching. Did the Buddha teach Buddhism? No. Did you know that the Buddha didn't even use the word Buddha? He used the word Tathagata, which means the one that is thus gone. Buddhism, Buddha means awake, means wake up-ism. He didn't teach Buddhism, he taught something called the Dharma. And that's another interesting thing, is that the Buddha, actually has a name for the thing that he taught. And it's the Dharma, it's not Buddhism. And the Dharma is simply a map, it's a path, it's practices. It's another interesting thing about Eastern religious practices and Western religious practices, to generalize a little bit, is in the West we have orthodoxy, belief-centered religions. In the East, they have practice-centered religions. So it's not about what you believe in, it's about what you do. And even still to this day, from my experience, I actually was hanging out with an Indian guy in a sauna one time, and I was like, he got into talking about spirituality, and I was like, well, what do you do? He started talking about Buddhism and Hinduism, and I was like, what do you believe? And he's like, believe? What does belief have to do with it? He's like, I meditate. He's like, I honor my ancestors. And he started telling me the things he did. The Polycanon was translated into English by the British. And as things are, it wasn't their fault, but it's, largely you translate things based into the cultural worldview that you understand. I heard that the first translators of the Polycanon thought that because they saw the word dharma everywhere, they thought that it meant law, because dharma means the way things are. So they thought it was like the legal code of India, of ancient India. And so they started having judges do the first translations of the Polycanon. A couple other interesting things about the Buddha's life is that he would have had several years to teach and to form a monastery after his, whether real or believed or whatever, after his awakening. So it's pretty well confirmed that he would have been around quite a while and have formed the monastic order for a long time before his death, which is rare for a lot of religions. Like supposedly Jesus died pretty quickly, and, I don't know all the different religious histories, but the Buddha was around and established the monastic order. And then shifting into the suttas, just real quickly, another interesting thing is that it was an oral tradition for 400 years. So nothing was written down. And I found out that religious studies scholars say that oral traditions are often better preserved than written traditions. Because if you think about it as a historian, if you just find, or an archaeologist, you find one book that says, oh, this is the guy, the Buddha, and this is everything he did. You don't know who wrote it, you don't know. But if you find 20,000 communities of people dispersed over a continent that have been somewhat engaged with each other, but also largely isolated from each other, and they're all kind of saying the same thing, and that started because of an oral tradition, discourses that were recited, it's pretty phenomenal. So after the Buddha's death, the first Buddhist council met, they say soon after, and they say that it was 500 of his disciples, monks, and that they recited the teachings and committed them to memory. What likely was happening is that when the Buddha would give a teaching, the monks were like, all right, dude, you got to hang on every word. I want you just to start repeating it in your head as soon as he starts talking. And then they would get together afterwards and they'd say, what did you hear? Oh, I heard this. No, he said this. And they'd create the teachings in this repetitive chant. And then at the first Buddhist council, they all got together and they checked their answers. The teachings were finally written down in 29 BCE, so it's a few hundred years after the Buddha's death, into something we refer to as the Polycanon. They were recorded and they were found in Sri Lanka. They chose to record the teachings in something called Pali Sanskrit as opposed to Sanskrit, which was more of it wasn't a spoken language and it wasn't the language the Buddha spoke. A lot of times people say that, but it was a written language that was a Middle Indo-Aryan dialect. It was a commoner's language. It was a written language that merchants would use. The Polycanon is referred to as the Tripitaka, or the three baskets. And there are three different baskets of the Polycanon. The first is the Vinaya Pitaka, and then there's the Sutta Pitaka, and then there's the Abhidhamma Pitaka. The Vinaya Pitaka are the monastic codes. So monks live by ethical codes. What's cool about this is it's not just these moral commandments. There are a lot of them. There's 300 and something. But if you look at the Vinaya Pitaka, if you read into it, there's stories about certain situations where monks were handling ethics. And in some situations, the Buddha responded one way, and in some situations, he responded the opposite. So what it is kind of a recorded way of how communities can live in harmony, but that ethics are situational. And it's kind of cool how particular circumstances were addressed by the Buddha during the time. Ethics are to be held loosely. They promote unity, but they're situational. That's kind of the point. The Sutta Pitaka, which is what Rachel and I are going to be teaching from over the next several weeks, and she's already started, is the discourses that the Buddha gave. In the Abhidharma Pitaka, the third basket, is the text on Buddhist psychology, which is a systematic framework on the nature of mind, and we won't get into that right now. The Sutta Pitaka has 5 collections of suttas. They're organized based on, as Theravadan Buddhists do, best practices of organizing things instead of order of importance or chronology. So there's the Digha Nikaya, which is the long collection of discourses. So these are the long ones. There's the Majjhima Nikaya, which are the middle-length ones. There's the Samyutta Nikaya, which is the grouped collection. There's the Anguttara Nikaya, which is called the furthered factored collection. And then there's the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is the collection of little texts. All right, we'll open it up. The conclusion here, and the reason why I wanted to share this is, you're a Buddhist when you say you are. This is a little bit of our history. It's a little bit of how we got here. Buddhism is both a religion and, in its essence, is a practice and not a religion. The Wildhearts Lineage were American convert Buddhists practicing Theravadan Buddhism. Theravada is steeped in the Polycanon and the Sangha. What was significant about the Buddha's teachings is that he radically interfaced with his society. He wanted to break free of the oppressive class system. He believed that every person had the potential to wake up in this lifetime. He believed that that was based on the quality of your mind and your heart and your actions and not on the circumstances you were born into. And why are we studying it? Is because these are the teachings that were taught 2,600 years ago, that were orally passed along for 400 years. And they still feel helpful today to me.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wildheart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.